Okay, so the only other thing I want to explain, this is one of the things that a lot of people trip up on. The way this editor works is you've got a touch handler attached to this object. It allows me to drag it. And then when I release it, I've got another touch handler that catches the event here. So each of these grid pieces has a touch handler, and each of these pieces has a touch handler. So I want both touch handlers to fire when I drag and drop over the screen. So the easiest way to do that was to write this touch handler so that when it ends, it sets a variable and says, you just let go of this piece, the square, or you just let go of the start piece. And it stores it in a variable, which was, I pointed it out at the top, last drop. It's just a string that says this is the last piece I dropped, and then I know as long as my end occurred, I lift my finger or I let go of the mouse and it's over the grid, then the touch listener for this one of these blocks is going to fire. And when that touch listener fires, it looks at the variable last drop, and if it's set to nil, it does nothing. If it's set to some value, it says, oh, I'm supposed to create that value here. I'm supposed to mark this block as containing the starting position or a round block. So let me go back to the listener. So we have one listener, touch listener, that's called piece dragger, and its job is to move the pieces, to record their initial position, to move them as you drag, and then when you let go, it sends that piece back to its original position on the tray. So let go, and then you don't see it in that exact same frame. It moves back to the place on the tray. But as you're dragging along, the piece comes with you, and that way you can see where you're going to place it. The only other thing it does is when I release, it sets the last drop type to whatever the type of that particular piece was marked as. Then we have another touch listener, which is the edit grid touch listener, and each of these squares here has the listener attached to it. So there are 64 squares, 64 listeners. This listener is waiting for an ended phase. In other words, I lifted my finger or I let go of the mouse button. And it checks to see, was the last drop variable set? If it was set, then I'm going to change the type of this block to whatever that was. And then I'm going to redraw this block so that it shows the right graphics.
Can you please show me the last touch listener you showed?
Sure. Is that what you're looking for? That I'm returning false?
No. If you pick an item and then you drop it not on the grid, and then you make mouse click somewhere outside of your drawer and move it to the grid and release it on the grid, will it trigger the object to appear on the grid?
Yeah, okay. So what you're saying is if I drag over here, let go, then I click on the screen, and I let go. Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that was because some people, this is the same thing with game design. Some people think one way, some people think another. So I said, you know, forget it. I'm going to let both work. So you can drag and drop, or you can click and click. But your elaborate example was a drag and a drop, and the release was the same as if I had done, sorry, I dragged too fast. By releasing, that's the same as if I had clicked. It's the same. But this touch didn't get activated because I wasn't over the grid. But that piece is still recorded as the last piece that I was editing or that I had selected. So do that, touch. But now if I touch again, I've cleared it. So once you place a piece, I clear it. It's just a choice.
A useful thing for level editors is copy-paste.
Yeah, I was going to add a copy-paste, or you could, like, I was going to say, add a touch listener to this and then hold, like, the control key or command key down and then drag and be able to draw more of these sequentially. But then I said, once I do that, then I make the touch listeners more complicated, and people will have trouble following this. So for the audience, for the people listening, this is the rudimentary entry stage to one way to do an editor, and you can expand from this. You can completely do something different, but the point is that look at these two different touch listeners and understand how you can get two different touch listeners working in concert to achieve the goal, which is to create a piece somewhere else on the board. Okay, so we do a refresh, which was I changed the type of the block that I just dropped over or tapped on, and then when I refresh, it basically redraws that block, showing the correct graphics. So, for example, if I had a start piece, but then I dragged a turret on it, it changed this to a turret type, and then it redrew the block, so the right graphic would show.
I might have missed it, but do you use any keyboard hotkeys at all for the?
I'm not using any keyboard keys at all. I don't have any keyboard.
A tip: if you had to develop like a lot of levels, like 100 or so, implementing keyboard hotkeys will save you lots of time. For example, here you can assign keyboard keys for each object, and when you place an object, it automatically gets selected and placed on the board, and you can change the subtype of the object or some like other stuff like, I don't know, block properties.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with adding keyboard shortcuts to change the selected type and make modifications to the currently selected grid. Anything that's natural for a person to do makes sense. I didn't want to go down that road because, one, it made the editor more complicated, and two, I don't want to force on somebody else my concept of what the keyboard mapping should be. I think this is something people should discover on their own. But your tip is one that I also use. So like this would be 1, this would be 2, 3, 4, and then it'd probably put a little number under it. And then I could just click 1 on the keyboard and click, 2, click, and then I could easily quickly edit without having to drag and drop, because I'm not really much of a drag and dropper when it comes to editing. I like very much like keyboard shortcuts. And that is really all there is to it. There's, like I said before, there's a function here called refresh detail tray, and it's interesting and long, and people should walk through it. But its job is to redraw this area based on the type of the block that you have selected over here, and any settings that you may have changed. For example, if I turned on 2 coins, and then I click over here, and then I click back, it clears this out, redraws this, says, oh, you've got 2 coins turned on. Let's toggle those buttons so it properly reflects the settings for this block or this grid element. This is probably the longest function in the entire editor. And then the second longest function is going to be the refresh grid. So the refresh grid, depending on the type, laser turret, rotating laser turret, generic type, will do more or less drawing steps to draw the right graphic, to add these little lines, to make the markers to show you where it starts and ends based on the type. So, for example, when I click different types, I get different results in the editor based on the type, and it tells me what type it is and details over here. But you get a little visual feedback here, you get a little textual feedback here, and everything's pretty straightforward.
So let me ask you, Ed, did you plan this out ahead of time, or did things kind of dictate as you went along?
I planned a little bit ahead of time. I knew that we were working with a fixed level, so I knew I could set up a fixed grid. If the level could have an infinite number of rows and columns, I would have approached this a lot differently. Because you can't draw an infinite number of blocks and put touch listeners on them, right? So you're stuck with this kind of scenario, and then you got to be able to drag it around so you can say, oh, I'm looking at this part of the level. But a nice small 8x8 level, I can easily represent that with a grid on the screen. And then knowing that that portion of my editor was going to be fixed, I said to myself, all right, well then I can make a tray for objects to drag and drop and a tray for the detail. So I planned that much in advance. But then as I went along, I started to realize details about how the game works, and the editor could be created to make it easier to edit these things. So some of it was organic, what I like to call organic, which is sort of like off the cuff, and then some of it was planned.